everybody. Welcome back. It's beautiful Tuesday here in Florida. Yeah, there we go. Cool. Let's kill that. How's everyone doing? I hope you're doing good. It's been a week since our last training Tuesday. Come back. I don't want that. I want that. I want that. Welcome back to First Landing's Training Tuesday. My name is Andrew, and I'm glad you joined us today. Last week, we spoke about weather and weather services and how those weather services apply to you as a pilot, how you can use them, what information I look for when I'm planning a flight, both long-term and in the short term. And today, we're going to talk about ramp checks. What are they? Why do they happen, and how do they happen? And how can you, as a pilot, protect yourself from a ramp check? So let's dive right in. We've all heard of ramp checks, right? Everyone knows what a ramp check is. You're at the airport. And an inspector, an FAA inspector, walks up to you and says, "Hi, I'm an FAA inspector. I'm going to take a look at your stuff." And that's how it begins. So let's jump right into it. I have a nice PowerPoint for today. Come back, kill that, kill that. Let's talk about surviving your ramp check, okay? And of course, Mr. Eddie Rickenbacker, aviation is proof that given the will, we have the capacity to achieve the impossible, right? That also includes surviving a ramp check. Surviving a ramp check is critically important, and they're very scary things. I get very nervous when somebody official starts looking at my paperwork. Every check ride I've ever taken, anytime I have an examiner looking at a student's logbook, it makes me nervous just because nobody likes having your work scrutinized that way. And that can go for your certificate, your medical, your plane, all that. I'm going to take my headsets off so I don't get confused about what I'm saying. So let's jump into surviving the check ride, okay? What is a ramp check? Basically, a ramp check is a conversation between an inspector, an FAA inspector, and a pilot, right? These are built for the reason being that just like the police are there to protect us in our homes and in our cities, inspectors are there to protect us in the air and make sure that we, as well as everyone that we are impacting by flying, are safe by our activities. They can, although they don't always result in enforcement activity against a pilot. Just because you're undergoing a ramp check does not mean that enforcement action is going to be pressured upon you, right? It can be a side effect, but that's not the intent. They can also be triggered by, really a number of things. The biggest one being that inspectors are everywhere, right? They exist. They are in the wild. They are out there surveying airports every day, and they're not always at the same airport, and their job is to roam. And they do sweeps from airport to airport to airport to airport, and they're looking for pilots in and out of compliance. And if they see something that makes them question whether what you're doing is safe, they might ramp check you. If ATC or another person on the ground says, "Hey, I think this guy's flying his airplane in an unairworthy condition," that can prompt a ramp check. And then the inspector can also just see you doing something unsafe or potentially dangerous and say that warrants a conversation to see what's happening here. And that initiates the ramp check, right? Can be random. They're just at the airport that day. They see you walking out to the plane and they say, "Hey, we're going to have a conversation," or somebody can contact them and say, "This guy's being unsafe. This guy's flying in an unairworthy aircraft," or they can see something themselves that makes them question what you're doing. So that is what initiates the ramp check. Now, what happens in the ramp check? Well, first and foremost, in the ramp check, okay, they're going to show up. And the very first thing they're going to do is they should say, "My name is Andrew. Nice to meet you. I am an FAA inspector. I need to have a few minutes of your time. That should be what happens. But if that doesn't happen, you need to ask for their identification. You're looking for proof that they are an inspector. Now, this isn't because we want to give them a hard time. This isn't because we want to give this inspector person a reason to doubt us. We're doing this because it's not safe or smart to let a random individual that you don't know, who potentially doesn't have authorization to look at your plane, right? You want to make sure that whoever is looking at your plane has the appropriate authorization and endorsements to do so, right? Some random Joe could walk up to you on the ramp and say, I'm an inspector, I want to see the inside of your plane. And there's a lot of reasons you probably don't want that to happen. You have expensive avionics inside the plane, or your personal stuff that you leave in there when you're not flying it. Or maybe they're looking for a plane to relocate to Mexico, and they think that you might just have a great one. So there's a lot of reasons you really want to verify that that inspector is an inspector. And those inspectors understand, and they completely understand why you would ask that. So if they don't present identification, make sure you ask. It's imperative for the safety of the airport, the aircraft, you as a pilot, and the FAA. Just make sure that you ask. The ramp check process always follows a outline called the inspection job aid. Now, you can actually go online and find this, and there is a document we'll look at the end of the conversation here that talks about what authorizations. It's the legal document, and I forget the name now, but it talks about the authorizations of the inspector and what they can and can't do legally, and we'll look at that here in a minute. But there is an official outline. It's this right here. These two sheets. It's basically a small little checklist. Just gonna go over everything listed here, and they're gonna take notes the whole time, and that always makes me nervous too, because again, people scrutinizing my work, I just don't like that. It's an uncomfortable feeling, but it is gonna happen, and they are gonna take notes, and just be ready for that. It's not a bad thing. Sometimes they're just making minor notes. Sometimes they see things that they like that you do. They like the way you store certain documents, or they like the way that you do certain things, and so they can make notes of that too, because that information, it can be useful to them. So that's the job aid. From there, they will ask to see your pilot certificate, and they will also ask to see your medical certificate if you are required to have one. Now, if you're not required to have one, they'll also ask for your photo ID, although they're more than likely going to ask for your photo ID anyway. So remember, we always have to have a government-issued photo ID and an airman certificate on us in order to utilize the privileges of that airman certificate. In addition to that, logbooks. Student pilots must present their logbooks. Remember, you as a student pilot, you cannot fly solo without an endorsement. They want to make sure that that endorsement is within the 90-day period in the same type of aircraft and model of aircraft that you're about to fly, and authorized for the airport that you're at. So they want to make sure that you have that endorsement in there as a student pilot. So make sure that you have your logbooks on you. That's imperative. Sport pilots also have to present their logbook if you're utilizing, if you're utilizing an endorsement. So remember, as a sport pilot, you can't fly into any airport that requires communications on the radio, basically a Delta, a Charlie, or a Bravo. If you are taking off out of a Delta airport, you need to have a Class Delta endorsement in order to fly out of that airport. And they're going to want to see that you have that in your logbook. Recreational pilots, you have a whole slew of endorsements you have to have on your person to make a wide variety of flights, and so you should always carry yours on you. And then sport pilot instructors have to carry their logbooks because, again, there needs to be some kind of authorization that you are a sport pilot instructor. And if you are a sport, let me quantify that. If you are a sport pilot flight instructor, if you are a private pilot with a sport pilot flight instructor certificate, this doesn't apply to you. But if you are a sport pilot with a sport pilot flight instructor certificate or authorization, You have to carry your logbook with you because that will contain information in there and endorsements in there pertinent to you. If you don't meet any of the above qualifications, if you are a private pilot, if you are an instrument-rated private pilot, if you are a commercial pilot, if you are an ATP pilot, it is best to leave your logbook at home. If it is not there, the FAA can't inspect it. Okay? Let me say that again. If your logbook is not on your person, the FAA cannot inspect it. And it's not that we want to withhold information from the FAA, but we don't want to get in the habit of going down the rabbit hole and providing the FAA with anything more than they need out of us, right? It's our job as pilots to make sure that we are recurrent and we stay within our 2-year BFR. It's our job as pilots to make sure that any additional training that we go through is appropriately logged. We don't need to prove that to the FAA unless we meet any of the previous qualifications. Okay, so if you don't need your logbook, don't carry it with you in the plane. Also, in the event of any kind of catastrophic incident, your logbook's going to become evidence for an insurance company, and the last thing you want is for it to be lost in a fire and a cloud of doubt to come around, and then it could be a whole other myriad of issues that could come out of that. So it's always best not to fly with your logbook if you can avoid it. Let's move right along here. There's my next slide. Do not, under any circumstances, surrender your private pilot, sport pilot, commercial pilot, whatever it is. Don't surrender your certificate. You may show it to the inspector, and the inspector is probably used to having pilots not physically handing it to them. Don't hand your certificate to the instructor, or to the inspector, more appropriately. Show it to them. You are required to show it to them, to present it to them. But once you physically hand them your certificate, you're kind of at their mercy to get it back. Now, there's a caveat to that because an inspector does not have the legal authority or authorization to detain you or to revoke your certificate. Excuse me. So if you hand it to them, now it's kind of like up to them when they want to give it back to you so you can leave. But they can't detain you if you have something going on, if you're actively in a flight planning process and you need to go somewhere. They can't detain you. And then the other important thing here is they can't board the airplane unless you, the pilot in command, say they can board the airplane. So having said that, they can look in the windows, they can take a look at the exterior of the aircraft, they can walk around the outside of the airplane. You can go into the airplane to get them things, to show to them, but they cannot board the aircraft without your permission. I'm going to take a brief pause here, and I'm just going to look and make sure both of our streams are going well, and they are. Neat. So I hope I've made that clear. There will be things inside the aircraft that the examiner needs to, or the inspector needs to see, and we'll get to some of those items in a little bit, but they don't have the permission to board your aircraft unless you say they do. And again, this gets into we don't want to go down the rabbit hole. We don't want to put ourselves in a position we can't really get out of. The inspectors are there to make sure that we are safe, but we also don't know what other motives they might have. Are they just doing a random sweep? Or are they looking to enforce a regulation upon you? Has somebody said that you are in violation of a regulation? Maybe it's a regulation you didn't realize you were in violation of. Maybe you didn't realize your standby airspeed indicator was inoperative and you've been flying with it inoperative this whole time. Well, that's 91.213 right there. And you might not know that, but they might figure it out if you let them inside the plane, or if you go down the rabbit hole, right? So the idea is to protect yourself in this instance because they might very well be there because somebody called them on you. And if that's the case, you want to make sure that you don't wind up having your certificate suspended or revoked for something minor. Okay, let's move on from there. Next slide here. What are the inspectors authorized to inspect? Well, they hold authorizations to take a look at your airworthiness certificates, your registration, your operating handbook, and your weight and balance. Remember, the aero must be, this is imperative. Your aero documents, they must be on board the plane, and they must be valid, current, and for that aircraft. You must have a valid airworthiness certificate for that aircraft on board the plane. If it has been changed since then, maybe you changed your standard category aircraft to an experimental for some reason to do the maintenance yourself, and you just never put the experimental in that plane and you still have your standard airworthiness certificate in there, that is not valid. That is not a standard category aircraft any longer, and that is a violation. Okay, so make sure it's the appropriate airworthiness certificate for that aircraft. Make sure your registration hasn't expired. Remember, your registration expires every 3 calendar years. It's important to keep that up to date, because if they see an expired registration in there, that's the violation of a regulation right there. Operating handbook. This one's kind of important for a lot of reasons. We always need the ability to make measurements on aircraft performance and aircraft performance data. The temperature doesn't stay the same all the time. We might wind up at an alternate airport we didn't expect, and we need to know that we can get out. So it's always important to have a current, valid operating handbook for your aircraft on board. If you have a 172M, you can't use a handbook for a 172O. It has to be a 172M handbook, and it has to be the handbook for that aircraft, which you can always get from the manufacturer. Weight and balance is also really important. This one is key. They have the, we're going to talk about weight and balance for a moment here. The inspectors have the authorization to inspect your weight and balance profile for your plane. Now, if you hand that document to the inspector, and the inspector is looking at it, and he sees that you have a Garmin G5 in there as a standby display, right, in your Cessna, and he's looking at that weight and balance profile, and your Garmin G5 is not listed on the weight and balance profile, that is a violation. That is not a current, up-to-date weight and balance profile for that aircraft, and you need to have your aircraft reweighed with that Garmin G5. I know it only weighs 4 pounds, or whatever the weight is. It doesn't weigh hardly anything, but you still have to have that particular instrument listed in the weight and balance profile before you fly. Otherwise, your weight and balance profile is not legal, okay? So make sure that when you hand them that document, it contains everything that is permanently installed in that airplane, right? And there is a distinction here between temporary installations, such as a suction cup mount for an iPad, and a permanent installation, such as screwing an iPad mount into the panel. So make sure you understand the distinctions in those. Minimum equipment lists. If your aircraft has an MEL, they want to see that all of the appropriate equipment for that aircraft is in there, as well as all appropriate equipment for 91205, your Tomato Flames equipment. All of that equipment must be installed in the airplane. If they don't see one, it's probably going to be a problem. So you want to make sure that all of the equipment you need in your plane is actually there. And remember, you as the pilot are responsible for ensuring that that equipment is in the plane and functions, that that aircraft is airworthy before you fly it. You have to make sure that that aircraft is safe to fly. If you don't, it's on you. Nobody else but the pilot, right? Well, and the operator. But still, you are the person putting your certificate in the hands of the inspector when they come to see that that airplane is something you are willing to fly, if that makes sense. Let's see. In addition to that, we also want to make sure that if we are, I'm going to pause on MELs really quick here and 91205. If you are in an area that requires a specific piece of equipment, so I am right now sitting under a Class B shelf within the 30 nautical mile ring of a Class B airspace, I have to have a Mode C transponder that broadcasts in Mode C when I fly. Otherwise, I can't fly out of this airport. So make sure any appropriate equipment for the airport you're at is also in that plane. Okay, let's move on from there. Aeronautical charts, approach plates, or electronic navigation information is subject to their inspection as well. If your chart is out of date, they might flag you for that. I haven't really heard of anyone being flagged for a chart being out of date. People have been told they have to go buy a current one. And if you're using an EFB, the most important thing if you're using ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, any of the electronic flight bag products out there, make sure that the information in your EFB is updated. ForeFlight comes out with updates, I think every 2 or 3 weeks or so. I get a notification that there's updates for ForeFlight. You just want to make sure you keep that information up to date. They can also inspect the general airworthiness and condition of the aircraft. If you are about to get into a plane that has an inch of dust on the cowling, they might take note of that. If you are about to get in a plane that maybe has a flat tire, they might take note of that. So that's important information to look at as well. Okay. ELT batteries, they want to make sure that the ELT batteries are in compliance. The appropriate inspections are done. VOR checks, they also want to make sure your VOR checks are in date as well if you're using the aircraft for instrument flight. Outside of that, you aren't required to have VOR checks. And then seats and safety belts, are they in good condition? Are they for that aircraft? Are you using your seats and safety belts appropriately? That's important as well. They're going to take a look at that when they come to inspect your aircraft as well. Okay. So that is what the inspector does. That's what they're looking for. What should you do in the event you get ramp checked? Well, the first one is cooperate and be courteous, right? The inspectors have a job to do. They're getting paid to do their job. They're not there to be rude or mean, and they certainly don't want to get into a conflict. And I don't think you do either, specifically because you're probably going to wind up on the losing end of any conflict between you and an inspector. So be courteous and cooperate within legal limits, right? If he says, hand me your pilot certificate, you're not required to. If he says, may I see your pilot certificate, you must show it to him. Don't go down the rabbit hole, right? I've said that a couple times here. We want to make sure we don't provide more information than we need to. And it's not that we're trying to intentionally withhold information, but oftentimes we don't even realize that something's been a problem until somebody else points it out. And we don't want to volunteer what might be inaccurate information or a violation if we're not asked. So don't go down the rabbit hole. And remember, legally speaking, the inspector cannot delay or detain you. So be busy. Look busy. You have a destination to get to. You have a person waiting on your departure. You need to get off the ground. The inspector is only legally able to hold you for the amount of time as it takes for him to complete his paperwork. If he is being slow intentionally, if he is being counterproductive, if he is attempting to stall or delay you, he or she does not have that legal authority, and you can point that out to them. You're detaining me. You don't have that authority. I need to go. If it's becoming an issue, you also have the option of calling a FSDO. So if you've been there for half an hour and the dude is still taking a look at your airplane and doesn't want to get out of the way, you can call the FSDO. That's always an option to you. And then one other tip that you have is to keep the correct documents easy to find. In all of our airplanes here at First Landings, we keep our aero documents in a pouch or in a box. It's usually a combination of the two. Our airworthiness and registration are in a clear-sided pouch, so they're directly visible. And then we have a box directly below that has a binder in it with the rest of the paperwork for the plane, the handbook and the weight and balance. So if I ever get ramp checked, I can literally just pull those two things out, the pouch and the box, and I can, there you go, have a great day. But that goes in addition to your charts, your weight and balance profiles, your approach plates if you're using an instrument approach. That's important as well. And engine logbooks and aircraft logbooks shouldn't be stored in the plane, so make sure you don't store them in the plane either, because if you do, they're up for inspection with an inspector too. So make sure you keep the documents you know you're going to need in a ramp check easy to find. Make sure you have your driver's license on you or a valid government-issued photo ID and your pilot certificate, right? Oh, I forgot my pilot certificates in another pair of pants is not an excuse for flying a plane without it on your person. So just remember that. And then let's see here. Last but not least, there are no Miranda rights in a ramp check. Anything you say or do can be used against you. So let's say, hypothetically, they come out with the intent of inspecting you to see if you've been in violation of a regulation. Anything you do that could potentially help them, there is no point. It's not like you're being arrested and you have the right to remain silent, and that is the period of time from which things you say and do can be held against you. The whole time you are being inspected. So keep that in mind. You're always being looked at. You're always being inspected. That's always important to make sure you give the appropriate response. Let's see. Let me jump back over here really quick. I'm just making sure we have no comments in the feed. If you guys have questions, by the way, feel free to leave them in the comments or on Facebook, or if you're watching this on YouTube, because I am streaming this to YouTube for the first time, you can leave your comments on YouTube as well, and I'll answer them at the end of the presentation here. And last but not least, the last thing I'm really going to talk about here, and let me take my face off the screen here, is AOPA. Now, all of my information today has come from the AOPA website. They are pilot advocates, and I can't speak highly enough about them. AOPA has a whole bunch of documents on their website that talk about ramp checks and what your rights are and what you can and should do as a pilot. And there's a slew of information on here about making sure you are safe and legal. So AOPA, if you're not an AOPA member, I highly recommend it. They also have a pilot protection service. I'm not sure the pricing on it, but if you do get ram checked and you're found to be in violation, they have a team of legal experts that can help keep you safe. We're not paid by AOPA. We don't have a membership with AOPA or membership. We don't have a marketing thing with AOPA. I am personally an AOPA member, and I find a lot of the documentation from their website highly resourceful. So AOPA is always a good idea. If you feel like AOPA, or if you feel like you might have, I lost my train of thought. If you feel like you've had a unfair ramp check, or you've been unfairly called as being in violation, Brooke, yeah, that's good. Yeah, Brooke, I was saying that I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry if I'm not. That he's had a couple of ramp checks and wound up clean, and the plane was clean too. I mean, inspectors aren't there to get you. They just want to make sure that you're safe, and they want to make sure that the public is safe, and they want to make sure that we are flying within reasonable safe limits. So, again, it's a scary thing. It's not the end of the world. I don't see any other questions on here. If you guys have any questions, I have a couple seconds left before we're going to end. I'm going to call that a day then. I hope this was informative. I hope you guys got something out of it. Thank you for watching this particular episode of Tuesday Training, or Training Tuesdays. And next week, we'll have another edition back on. Remember, share, subscribe on YouTube, share, like us, follow us on Facebook. I'm getting backwards now. It's just that time of day. But if you have any information, feel free to send us an email. Leave a comment on the video on Facebook or YouTube, and I will look at that periodically, and I can answer your questions if you have a question, if you're watching this after the fact. So I hope you guys have a great Tuesday. Thanks for spending your lunch with me, and we'll see you next time on Training Tuesdays. All right, bye all.